Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Planning Through a Pandemic, Estate and Financial Tips for Preservation and Protection.
My name is Katie French. I am an estate planning attorney with Lamson Dugan Murray.
And my name is Katie Bruno, and I am a certified financial planner with Maureen Quinn Wealth Partners. So it is no secret that COVID-19 has impacted all of our lives in some way. Many of us are going on week 12, 13, or even 14 of practicing social distancing. And I know that many of us are feeling like our lives are suspended as we stay safe. All of this is done in part to protect ourselves and to protect each other. And I know for me personally that I keep having to remind myself that by being patient, I'm doing my part for the community. But at the same time, I think this pandemic has made many of us realize what's important. And that includes our health and our family and our friends. And I think now is a very smart time to start planning on how we can prepare for crisis. We've all faced challenges and overcome challenges in dealing with the coronavirus. And I think there is an important lesson and an opportunity that we can all embrace. A crisis is not a once-in-a-lifetime event. In the last decade alone, we've had 2 financial crises. We've now had this global health crisis. And additionally, we should consider the frequency of natural disasters, hurricanes, wildfires, and for those of us here in Nebraska, the floods. So as we go through our presentation today, we want to provide you with an opportunity to rethink your crisis expectations and your plan. And that includes your estate plan and your financial plan. We want to give you some resources and some tools so that once you start putting together and implementing your plan, you can feel better going into it knowing you are more prepared.
So in today's discussion, the questions that I will ask, I want you to be thinking about as far as navigating your estate plan will be: who needs an estate plan? Who gets your property? And what are your wishes? So all of these things we're going to touch on today, and hopefully you will have some answers to these questions by the time we're done with our discussion.
Great, and then I will be touching on navigating your finances, and we'll talk about some ways that you can increase your financial security today. And then I'll talk a little bit about investor behavior, because during a crisis, we all experience these social and emotional factors that influence how we think about our investments and the decisions we make around our investments. And then my last discussion topic is going to be about the importance of having a long-term plan in place.
And I think it's important to note as well that obviously this presentation is focused on COVID-19, but also all of these are good questions to ask yourself for beyond this pandemic and reasons to plan long-term as well. All right, so for the estate portion of this, I'm going to start with, why do you need an estate plan? These are sort of the top reasons that I will tell clients that it's a good reason to have a plan. As in most cases, usually the best answer is not to do nothing, right? So having a plan is always going to be better than not, because then you get to put your wishes into place. So some of the main reasons to have a plan would be: minors cannot inherit. So if something were to happen to, say, you and your spouse and you have small children, you want to be the one who can make the decision of who's in charge of your assets to distribute them to your children. Also, control. Again, at the end of the day, you've worked hard for your assets. You have substantial value built up. You want to determine where that value goes, to who it goes to, and when it goes to them. To avoid court proceedings. Obviously, we'll talk about today what that all involves and the process that will happen if you do not have a plan. And again, usually having a plan is a better reason, because you'll save time and money, if nothing else, if none of these other reasons are enough for you. Also maintaining relationships. I think the biggest thing that I see, unfortunately, with the clients who don't have a plan is that, you know, families end up fighting. Everyone says, well, my kids will get along, it won't happen to me, or my family won't have this problem. I don't need a plan, I don't want to spend money, you know, on an attorney. And a lot of times those are the ones where when you're gone, people don't get along, as well as when you're here, obviously. So at the end of the day, we don't want money to come in between a family relationship. And also to preserve value. There's efficient ways to do this. And we want to do that, and that may be a little bit of cost up front, that may be the planning up front, but in the long run, the ultimate goal is to make sure that you're saving time and money when you're not here. So to essentially answer the question, who needs an estate plan? If you have a home, you should have a plan. If you have kids, you should have a plan. Essentially, if you have any value, you should have a plan, and there's different plans, and I'm happy to talk to each of you specifically about what would be best for your personal situation. But again, usually the answer is not to do nothing, and we will go over what happens if that is the case. So just to touch base kind of from a high level as to what happens when someone passes away. That is typically referred to as the probate process, which some of you may have experienced. That is the process through the court where someone is granted legal authority to essentially step into your shoes since you were deceased. If you have a will, the court will follow the terms of your will. However, there are ways to avoid this process, and we'll talk about that. But this is essentially what happens if you have a simple will or you have nothing and you pass away. There is going to be a court process involved. And a lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people think, oh, I did a simple will on LegalZoom, you know, I'm all set. Well, unfortunately, that's sort of half of the answer. But then there still has to be a process to implement or carry out that will so that someone, again, has legal authority to handle your assets and distribute them to whoever is listed in that will. So it's essentially the process of gathering all of your assets, paying debts, and then distributing your assets to your heirs. So again, if you have a will, it would be distributed pursuant to that. Or if you don't have a will, it would be distributed pursuant to the law. And those heirs may or may not be the people that you intended for your assets to go to. So again, that's a reason to have a plan. And this process can be fairly costly. Again, it is avoidable, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the next couple of slides. But, you know, it doesn't matter essentially the size of your estate, whether you're just probating for a house, which is where I see a lot of probates come into play because it's typically titled jointly. And when the second spouse dies, if there's not a will, or even if there is a will, a probate would be required. So you're looking at substantial legal fees because there's a number of forms. There's a process that every estate has to follow. It doesn't matter the value. You still have to follow a certain time frame for administering the estate with the court, as well as filling out all of these forms. So there's considerable time and cost involved. So what assets get probated? In a nutshell, the assets that get probated are assets that don't have a beneficiary listed, don't have a joint owner, and are not in your trust. So again, essentially, if you do a simple will and everything is in your personal name at the time of your passing, you will have to open an estate with the court and go through the probate process. If everything you have at the time of your passing is in a trust, or you have beneficiaries listed, you will likely avoid the probate process. And again, we'll get into this a little bit more in detail, but there are options. So at the end of the day, this is not required for everyone, and there are legal ways to save your family time and money after your passing to avoid this process. What happens if you don't have a will? I'm really hoping that it's not what you see in that picture. However, a lot of the cases I have do turn into families fighting. What we want to do, obviously, is prevent what you see in that photo. The law determines your heirs essentially if you don't have a will. So, and then what they get. So most people don't understand that. You know, they may think that, well, if I die, everything will go to my wife. Under the law, that is not the case. So for example, in Nebraska, if you pass away without a will and you have a spouse and you have children, your spouse will essentially only get half of your estate. Your spouse does not get everything. Now, that does not include any joint assets that you may own with your spouse. That would go to them because that falls under the beneficiary designation that I talked about above. But obviously, it's not ideal for the law to be determining who your heirs are and what they get. You want to be the one that does that. So now we're going to get into some of the common estate planning documents, and we'll talk about the specifics of each of the documents. The first one is the will. Again, that's the one that folks are most familiar with. And having a simple will, again, does not prevent you from having to go through the court process. I think a lot of people are under the misconception that if you do a will and, you know, that's it, you put it in a drawer, that you're all set. But if you just have a simple will, you will have to go through court to have someone essentially step into your shoes to administer your assets when you're gone. The key thing that you can do in a will is twofold. One, if you have minor children, appoint a guardian for them so that if something were to happen, say to you and your spouse, you have designated who would be in charge of your children, which is a key item, obviously, and a concern for most parents. Also, you would designate who's the personal representative or the executor, same thing, just different terminology, of your estate, so that if you do have to go through that court process, you are determining who's in charge of distributing your assets, and then obviously how your assets are distributed. So the will is sort of the key document, but I want to point out, again, that it's not the only document. There are additional documents that you should include to have a complete plan. And really, there's very few situations where I would advise someone that just a will itself is sufficient. The next document would be a trust, which is usually paired with the will. I'm going to skip to the next slide here for a minute because I have listed some advantages of a trust. The biggest advantage of a trust is that you avoid that court probate process. Legally, if you have a trust set up and your assets end up in that trust or are put in that trust while you're alive, you don't have to go through that court process. So that is the biggest benefit I like to tell people about. Some of the other factors you can see here are you are controlling where your assets go after your death. So you're essentially putting together a document that says who gets your assets, how they get your assets, and when they get your assets. It's very similar to what I think people think a will does, but the trust itself, again, avoids that probate process. You can use it as a motivational tool. So for example, if your children know that there's money out there, you know, you can provide, for example, that they don't get money until they graduate from college or meet certain milestones. And then at that point, they would be given money. Protection from creditors and ex-spouses. It can be used as a tool to shelter, you know, if there's a child you're worried about that has a spending problem, or a child you're worried about that is maybe getting divorced. So there's legal protections that a trust can offer beyond just a simple will where a child, for example, would be getting just an outright lump sum. You know, there's a nest egg there for beneficiaries. Again, if you're concerned about kids or grandkids or nieces or nephews receiving a lump sum and blowing through that in a very short amount of time, you can put parameters on the trust for when money would be received, how it can be spent, things like that. And again, the probate avoidance we already spoke about. You can really make the trust as complex or as simple as you want it. So, I mean, it can be strung out over a number of years, Or if you're purely going for the probate avoidance, it can be very simple and just pay directly to all of your adult beneficiaries upon your passing. You can fund it during your life, or have beneficiary designations directed to go into your trust, so that essentially there's very little work to do at the time of your passing, because everything will automatically go into your trust or will already be there. So back to some of the other estate planning documents, especially with the COVID discussion that we're having today. Two of the most important documents, and I would say if you're not going to do anything else immediately, the two documents that you should make sure you have are the financial power of attorney and the healthcare power of attorney. These documents essentially name someone to make decisions on your behalf if you are physically or mentally incapacitated and unable to do so for yourself. And that may be temporarily due to an illness or hospitalization, or it may be permanent, later in life, something like a dementia diagnosis or something like that. The financial power of attorney, essentially, you're designating someone to make financial decisions on your behalf. More importantly here, I think with COVID, the healthcare power of attorney is you're designating an agent to make healthcare decisions on your behalf. Again, should you be unable to do so. If you do not have these documents and something should happen to you, the only way that a relative would be able to make decisions on your behalf would be to go to court. They would have to go to court and have a guardian and a conservator appointed. So again, we're talking about time and money to essentially do the same thing we can do through these documents. And I have it happen a lot. I wouldn't say that is a rare occurrence at all, where, someone doesn't want to do planning, they just don't want to take the time to put these documents together. And then again, they either fall ill or they're in an accident. Not just COVID, obviously other accidents can happen. And then they're at a place where they are not able to make decisions on their own. And we have to go to court and get someone who has, again, authority to essentially step into their shoes and make decisions for them. And that's hard on your family. This is something that can be done ahead of time and make their lives easier, so that when you're in a very emotional situation, you're not dealing with legalities on top of it. As far as the healthcare power of attorney goes, that is who can make decisions regarding your healthcare. There's also a document called a living will, which is often combined with the healthcare power of attorney and called an advance directive. And that living will document is essentially you designating what sorts of life-sustaining or life support treatment you would want and how you're going to deal with end-of-life situations. So that one is very key, and I always, again, tell people that makes things easier on your family. So it is a guide to your family as what you do or do not want in the event of a terminal illness or injury that leave you incapable of expressing your wishes. And so it removes that immensely difficult decision from your loved ones of having to guess, what would mom want me to do? What would grandma want us to do? What would my brother want me to do? You're making that decision in advance while you are competent to do so and can think about what you would want. And you're not making that decision in a crisis, and you're not forcing your family to make that decision in a crisis. So again, if there are two documents that I would highly recommend you do immediately if you don't want to do anything else, it would be the financial power of attorney and the healthcare power of attorney. And I do want to note that those documents are only valid while you are alive, but need assistance making decisions, essentially. Those documents will not do anything for you after your passing. So they're not a replacement for a will or a trust. They're not going to give the person you designate as your healthcare or financial agent authority to do anything with your assets after your passing. They are only going to help in the event that you are unable to make healthcare financial decisions for yourself. So again, just having those documents is certainly far from a complete plan, but it's still better than nothing. But the will and the trust are going to be the documents that prevail and direct what happens to your assets when you're gone. So again, that's a very important part of this process, and making sure you have both incapacity as well as death planned for. The other item I have on there, and this is not applicable to everyone, but a special needs trust as well. If there are children or grandchildren who may have disabilities or be receiving governmental assistance, there's certain planning that needs to be done to ensure those benefits are maintained should they inherit money from grandma and grandpa or mom and dad or any sort of family member. So that person needs some additional, more complex planning just to make sure that they're taken care of. And again, if that applies to you, I'm happy to discuss that in further detail with you. So just to kind of summarize what we have already gone through, here are the benefits that I see of an estate plan. And I do this pretty much all day, every day. And so I have seen a lot of families go through this. Convenience, because again, you are putting this together now to make things easier on your family when you're not here, or you're incapacitated and unable to vocalize what you would want. Cost savings. Again, at the end of the day, my objective a lot of times is just to avoid your family having to pay for that court process and deal with the extended time it takes to go through that court process and all the hoops you have to jump through legally. So if we can avoid that by doing all of the work now on the front end, that's my goal. Control. You have worked for your assets. You have worked to build up this value. You want to control where it goes. You do not want the law saying who gets what, because oftentimes that's not the same as what you would want. And that's when these conflicts come up where we end up in court battling this out, is because people aren't getting what they thought they were going to get, or aren't getting what you promised them they were going to get, because you just didn't take control of your plan and make a plan. Again, avoiding conflict, I see it all the time. You know, if we just document your plan now, we can avoid all of those problems on the back end. And peace of mind for you, knowing that, again, you're expressing your wishes that may be contrary to what your heirs want, but at the end of the day, it's what you want. And you have that peace of mind that you know that you're making things as easy as possible for your family members. I like to tell people, if you care about who you're leaving behind, you will make a plan. So here's some action items for today. If you do not have a plan and anything that I've talked about today seems like something that may apply to you, please call me. I'm happy to discuss any of this with you. Even if you just have some questions or need further information as to something that we've talked about today, or maybe there's a topic you have a question on that I didn't hit today, I'm happy to discuss that with you. If you have an existing plan, I would highly recommend reviewing it for any updates that you may want to make, or depending on when you made your plan originally, if it's been some time, there are often changes in the law that would warrant updating your plan. So even if you don't have a personal update, there may be a need to just revise your documents because there's been a change in the law. And if I look at your documents and there's nothing to do, I'm happy to tell you as well that they're sufficient, and there is nothing to do right now. Make sure your plan includes a financial and a healthcare power of attorney. As we discussed, those two documents are better than nothing. Again, it's far from a complete plan, but at least that would take care of immediate concerns, again, especially with COVID going on, in the event that for some, unforeseen reason you were to get ill and be incapacitated, then those decisions at least would be able to be made for you and easier on your family. Number 4, I didn't touch on this very much earlier, but make sure that your asset titling and beneficiary designations match your plan. This is a key item that an attorney doing an estate plan needs to make sure happens, because once you have the plan, you still need to make sure that the assets follow the plan. So for example, if you draft a trust and set up a trust, you need to make sure your assets are actually going to end up in the trust. That is done at the asset level with each financial institution. So this is something that takes additional follow-up. This is not, your house or your 401k or your investment account doesn't magically just end up in your trust because you now have a trust. You obviously have to notify, the place where you have the investment account to add your trust as a beneficiary. So that takes additional follow-up either by me as your attorney or you meeting with your financial advisor to make sure that it follows the plan we've now set up for you. And this is key because essentially who you have listed as a beneficiary on your assets prevails over your will or trust. So for example, if you set up an account a really long time ago before you were married and you have your mom on there, and now you're married and you intended to go to your spouse, but you never put her on there, it will go to your mom if she's your listed beneficiary, obviously assuming she's still alive, if and when something happens to you. But it will go to her because she's the beneficiary. It does not go to your spouse just because they are your spouse. It will not end up in your trust just because you drafted a trust if the financial institution does not know about your trust. So there's kind of two-step process. I like to tell people the first step is making the plan, getting everything executed. And then once you have a plan, whether that involves a will or a will and a trust, we have to follow up and make sure everything's going to end up there. So hopefully that was a helpful overview to you, high level just of the estate plan process, as well as some of the immediate action items that I would recommend specifically regarding this pandemic. Again, if nothing else, please make sure you have powers of attorney. And then if you want to discuss additional items that may be of use to you specifically and your family, I'm happy to do that. And obviously we'll tailor each plan specifically to you and your situation. I'm happy to have a conversation with you about that. So with that, I will ask if anyone has any questions, and thank you very much for your time.
All right, so moving on to the financial part of this. So estate planning and financial planning really go hand in hand. They both provide value to individuals and families who are interested in getting organized with their finances and their assets, and for those people who really want to plan for their future and create greater peace of mind and security. And I know Katie French touched on that. But generally speaking, financial planning has a more immediate goal. Financial planning really includes assessing a person's current goals, looking at their assets, their investment accounts, their businesses if they have one, and then working to make decisions about how we can make these assets create greater financial freedom or financial security in the future. And as Katie said, estate planning is generally preparing for your incapacity or the transfer of your assets at death. So we all know kind of what's going on in the market right now and the economy. We have rising debt levels, we have fluctuating markets, we have high unemployment, and it's very likely that coronavirus has impacted your finances in some way. And if it hasn't impacted you yet, you may be worried that it still might. Unfortunately, the coronavirus has pushed our economy into a recession, and this is something that is beyond our control. But what we can control is how we respond and what actions or measures we take to protect ourselves. So I put together a few tips here on what we can do to increase financial security today. Number one, assess your cash on hand. Tally up what's in your savings account, what's in your checking account, and you should be using a high yield savings account for your cash. And when I say high yield, because rates are so low, it might only be 1.5% that you're getting on a money market or high yield savings. Hold off on any big purchases. So it's kind of unclear how long businesses are going to remain closed for some. I know that we're seeing businesses reopen, so it's unclear if businesses are going to have to close again. But when you delay big ticket items, you're going to strengthen your personal finances and your balance sheet because you're going to have more money available later if you need it. Number three, cut any non-critical spending. If you do not have an emergency fund, and an emergency fund is a pool of cash that you reserve specifically for emergencies or downturns. If you don't have one, get one. This can make it possible for you to still afford your day-to-day expenses during an unexpected crisis like we have now. Clients are telling me all the time that they're focused on paying on debt, and I understand. But even if you're paying down debt, it's really important that you prioritize your savings. Focus first on loading up that emergency fund for 3 to 6 months of living expenses. And once you have that pool of money, then you can focus on paying off your high interest debt. 3 to 6 months, so which one is it, 3 or 6? Well, I like to say that if there is 2 incomes or a double income coming into the home, 3 months is probably sufficient. But if you're living on a single income, either you're married and only one of you brings home a paycheck, or you're single, then you probably need 6 months of living expenses covered. In this way, when you put that money towards debt, when an emergency arises and every dollar you have you are putting in towards debt, you don't have any choice but to go back to the credit card when you have an emergency situation because you don't have savings. Additionally, it's always a good idea to go through your monthly expenses and identify which items are discretionary. And discretionary means it's something you don't necessarily need. And then which items are a necessity. Necessities are expenses that we have to pay. So you have to pay the mortgage, you have to pay the rent, you have to pay your car insurance, you have to eat to live. So your groceries, your utilities, those are all necessities or essential expenses. But dining out, vacations, cable, anything that you would potentially consider a luxury or a lifestyle expense, that is discretionary spending. Number 4, look into your options for credit lines. So if the money coming in is not enough to cover the money that must go out, look to your emergency savings first. That's what it's there for. Pull from the money that you've set aside in a liquid savings account. In this way, you are not penalized if you have to withdraw funds from other accounts, such as your retirement. But if you don't have an emergency savings, or maybe it's not enough, you may need to borrow money. Borrowing is not a one-size-fits-all situation, so it's really your options and use borrowing as last resort. And lastly, deadline is July 15th. So if you have not filed taxes, it's important to do that, especially if you're getting a refund, because I know some people could get money during this time. If you owe the IRS, you don't want to get past that July 15th deadline, or you could be paying a penalty. So what if you can't pay your rent, mortgage, or student loans? Well, out of work, the reality is that you probably can't pay all your bills. So first, focus on your needs, food, shelter. And then if you have to, delay repaying credit cards or other debts until you're in a more stable financial position. For the bills you can't pay, communication is key. It's so important. You should be reduced interest rate, a different payment plan, or any other kind of relief that they have available. A lot of clients asking me about the HEROES Act, which is another wave of stimulus that the government could be providing to us. You know, I haven't heard. I think we're kind of at a gridlock between the Senate and the House on passing that. But if it is available, I don't think it will be measure the first or second stimulus package was. So should keep contributing to your 401k. Well, the last few months have been a roller coaster for the stock market. At the end of March, the S&P 500 had lost almost 30% of its value from its record high. It came back and gained about 11% in April, a little bit more in May, but as time continues, the stock market rallies are becoming less and less certain, and more Americans are filing for unemployment. We have this high level of claims for unemployment coming in, paired with this market volatility, and I know that many people are worried about their retirement savings. I'm talking to people and I'm hearing and I'm seeing an incredible amount of fear out there. People tell me they look at their retirement accounts often and they are concerned. So it's important to remember that the best decisions are not made out of fear. So here are my thoughts. If you are employed and you have a regular paycheck coming in and you're not panicked about losing your job, you should be contributing to both your retirement account and your emergency savings as you would normally. This is a great buying opportunity in the stock market if you are a long-term investor. When we have market dips, everything is going on sale. And this is the time that you may want to increase your contribution and take advantage of the stock market dip. If you fear you could be laid off, then now is not the time to try to time the markets. Instead of piling any extra money into your retirement, you should prioritize increasing that emergency savings. When it comes to existing retirement accounts, if you're worried about becoming unemployed, focus on contributing enough to take advantage of any employer match. So if your employer matches 3, 4, 5%, and you're currently contributing 10%, you may want to consider cutting back to the match, that 3, 4, 5%, whatever they're matching. You can then add that extra money to your emergency savings, especially if you don't have that 3 to 6 months of savings yet. If you have already lost your job, first and foremost, you are not alone. You should be focused on filing for unemployment if you haven't to you for your 401k. If you are out of work and you are facing a financial emergency because of COVID-19, it can be very tempting to just cash out the money. Again, this should be a last resort, and recommend talking to both a financial advisor and a tax professional before you do that. So what should you do with your 401k? Well, yes, the markets have been volatile, but please, please, please resist the temptation to mess around with your current investments, especially if you have a long-term time horizon. You cannot predict the highs and lows, and neither can I. So when it comes to investing over the long term, it's best to stay with your plan. This chart here illustrates how letting emotions can dictate your investing strategy. And so we see here 3 potential paths. We see the fearful investor is the turquoise line, and during the Great Recession, just in March of in January of 2009, they got out of the market. They exited the market and they invested in cash. And all through that time, the account stayed about flat, $56,122. If that investor who got out of the market had reinvested just 1 year later in 2010, he would have nearly 3 times the amount of money a decade later. But if that investor had just stayed the course and never got out of the market, they'd have 4 times the amount of money than the cash investor. You'll see that balance there of $227,993. So you can see here how this really shows how short-term thinking based on fear can have a significant long-term consequence. The investor who exited actually locked in their losses and they missed out on all those future gains. When we make decisions about our investments, they should really be driven by our risk tolerance and our time horizon. And when I talk about risk tolerance, I'm referring to your capacity to absorb financially and to stomach fluctuations in the value of your portfolio. Your time horizon refers to, or investment horizon refers to, the length of time and to the extent in which you anticipate making withdrawals. So market volatility can make us instinctively feel like we should be more cautious in our finances. And sometimes as a result of that, we may go into our 401k and move assets around. Well, I'm going to sell some of my stocks and buy bonds, or I'm going to go to cash. Well, not that these are horrible ideas, but they need to be done in conjunction with your risk tolerance and your time horizon, and maybe with working with a financial advisor who understands your desire to preserve and protect your wealth. So is panicking about your investments normal? Yes, yes, and it is called loss aversion, and we get it. Volatility is scary, and your gut reaction is to take action. But let's take a moment to understand what's happening and focus on your progress. So here is the emotions involved in investing, and being an investor really is an emotional journey, and we go through this cycle of emotions. So last year we were chugging along, we had optimism, excitement. October 2019 to February 2020, we reached this feeling of euphoria, and we had no fear. Volatility was low, stocks hit new highs. And then in January, we heard about the virus breaking out in China, and we became in denial. We hoped the virus would be contained, and we thought if it reached the US, it wouldn't be as bad as it is. But then the virus spread, and the forecast for the US economy changed, and we all became fearful. And then we started panicking. Cases of COVID increased, business and schools closed, and there was a steep economic fallout. And this was about mid to late March. And when we panicked, we started selling. And then we hit what we call capitulation, which is forced selling. And these investment firms and pension plans, they have guidelines in place so that stocks or assets don't hit a certain point, and when the price gets so low, they have to sell, and it's forced selling, which then creates even larger price declines in the stock market. And then we hit a place of despondency, and we felt like there was no way out. Where are we right now? I would say that we're somewhere around relief to optimism. We're seeing things reopen. We're seeing unemployment numbers come down a little bit, but we're looking at the other numbers and we're seeing them get better. TSA checkpoints, rail car traffic, gasoline purchases, that type of thing. We're seeing a recovery. Are we where we were a year ago? No, we are in no way where we were a year ago. But compared to where we were in March and April, we are seeing some recovery. So what else should you know about your investments? Well, historically, the market has delivered more consistent positive returns the longer an investment is held. And I know that it is tempting for everyone to monitor their accounts on a regular basis. We have instant access to real-time quotes and a barrage of media reports on the stock market. And all of this can make it very difficult for investors to stay focused on their goals, especially those long-term goals. But the reality is these daily market movements are not as extreme as they may seem when they're happening. When we look at things longer term, our perception also changes. So if we're looking at this chart, if we go back to 1937 and we look at the stock market on a day-by-day basis, 1 day at a time, the market was only positive 53.27% of the time. So it's almost a coin toss on whether you're going to make or lose money in the market on a day-by-day case. But when we open up the time periods and we look at the market on a 1 month by 1 month basis, or 3 month, or 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year, you can see that the probability of having a positive return increases dramatically over these longer time periods. If we look back to 1937 and at the market in 10-year increments, the market was up 97.27% of the time. So as they say, patience is a virtue, and there really is something to be said for a consistent investment strategy and holding your investments through the ups and downs of the market. So financial planning and uncertainty. So it is really important for me that everyone understands the role a financial plan can play in all of this. So financial planning is an ongoing, flexible process that helps you make decisions about your money to achieve your goals. And financial planning addresses uncertainty. When you think about your health, you could eat right, you could exercise, you could get 8 hours of sleep per night, but your health is still uncertain. Cancer and diseases happen that sometimes have nothing to do with whether we don't smoke or we eat right or we exercise. We have a myriad of other uncertainties in our life. If we think about how long are we going to live, what are taxes going to be like 10 years from now? What about inflation? Just this year, who's going to win the presidential election, and what impact is that going to have? And so there's all these things, and so the future is always uncertain, and that's what the financial planning process is about. It's about understanding and having discussions and running an analysis, looking at your income, looking at your assets, and looking at all these other variables and preparing and running projections. And when you meet with a financial planner, you're going to evaluate different options. You talk about when you're going to retire, when should you begin taking Social Security, what happens if the year I decide to retire, we go into a recession? What kind of return do we need on average on your assets to make them last through the rest of your life? And so these are different issues or scenarios that a financial planner will be able to work with you on. And as a financial planner, we have tools that can help you stress test your portfolio under these different circumstances. And over time, through these discussions and through meetings, you begin to get more comfortable and confident in dealing with the uncertainty of the future so that you can stick with your plan even when we have these volatile conditions or unexpected circumstances arise. So lastly, I also have some action items. I always like to give you something to take away and use immediately for results. So number one, remain steady. Focus on your long-term goals. Many investors are investing and saving for future goals. So if you are in your 40s and retirement is still 20 or 25 or 30 years away, well, this volatility in the stock market may be putting your risk tolerance to the test, but chances are your time horizon hasn't changed and your long-term goals haven't changed, so neither should your long-term plan. Two, I have already talked today about financial planning and why I'm so passionate about it. And we also talked about estate planning. And estate planning and financial planning are both important, but for specific reasons. And it is important that you speak with the right person about the right goals. An estate planning attorney cannot offer financial planning, and as a financial planner, I cannot plan and draft an estate plan. So it is really important that we as professionals work together to prepare our clients for the best outcomes. So if you don't have an advisor, maybe seek one out and then work on building your whole team. And what is a team of professionals? I would say it should include an advisor, an accountant, an estate planning attorney, maybe an insurance agent, all these different things that affect your financial life. Three, now is a great time to take a look at what you own, that's your assets, and what you owe, that's your debt. These two items make up your personal balance sheet. One of the strongest weapons you can have right now is a cash reserve. As I mentioned earlier, 3 to 6 months. If your income has not been impacted by the pandemic, you may have more cash on hand right now. simply because we're not going out and spending. We're not taking vacations. We're not eating out as much. And this is also the very thing that's dragging down the economy right now. But this is an opportunity for you to boost your cash reserves. Also, I mentioned that we have historically low interest rates. So this may be an opportunity for you to reset your debt. Refinancing your home mortgage, that could free up some cash flow. You may also have the ability to reduce your mortgage term from 30 years to 15 years and maybe have the same payment. So the final step in resetting your personal balance sheet is going to be to rebalance your investment allocation, which leads me to item number 4. The stock market is experiencing the first recession in about a decade. We didn't recover from the last recession, and depending on what numbers you look, some of the numbers didn't recover till 2015, some in 2012, so it just depends. But this really is the first recession that we've entered in the last decade. And the percentage of the stocks in your portfolio may have fallen in relationship to the bonds. And this is a very unintentional shift, but what it could cause is you to realize lower returns as the stocks recover. So it's a good time to realign or rebalance your portfolio. And this may mean you're buying more stocks and selling some bonds. And therefore you're kind of positioning your portfolio so that you can participate in the market recovery. Kind of look at volatility as an opportunity for gains. And lastly, you can rely on a financial advisor. You can rely on me for advice on how to manage the market volatility or position yourself to take advantage of these types of opportunities. So I'll just say thank you. We really appreciate the time that all of you took in listening to our webinar today. We are here. If you would like to talk to us, we are available for Zoom meetings, emails, phone calls. Please reach out to us if we can help you in any way. And then I'll go ahead and I'll open it up for questions.